Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first hybrid all legislative member briefing. As you know, every year the Joint Fiscal Office pulls together this important event to ensure that we all enter the session grounded in Vermont's revenues and budgetary pressures, as well as some of the key policy issues likely to come up during the legislative session. This year, this briefing will be particularly critical as we prepare for the historic influx of funds from the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity ARPA funds to state surplus revenue funds and other federal funding streams.
And what I'm going to do is just give you an overview of today's agenda. And the morning, we're going to be hearing from a revenue and economic update from the legislative economist, followed by presentations on the FY23 budget and an education outlook from staff at the Joint Fiscal Office. And finally, we were going to hear more about the federal funds and information about the ever evolving and shifting federal landscape on these funds. This afternoon, the speaker and I will share a little bit more about reopening plans for the State House and getting ready for the session, and tee up two policy presentations, which I think you'll find really interesting. The first from Secretary Moore on the Climate Action Plan, and then we'll hear from Commissioner Josh Hanford on Vermont's housing landscape. I know the one thing that everyone's hearing every corner of the state is the housing crisis. So that will be an engaging and informative presentation.
We want to thank you all in advance for your flexibility and ability as to work together as we attempt to do this hybrid event. The Joint Fiscal Office has been working hard to make sure the day goes smoothly and everyone feels that they are able to engage. And we ask you for your patience as we attempt this new way of meeting. JFO asks us to remind you of the following protocols for today. For those of you that are here in person, thank you for observing social distancing. The pink papers on desk map out 6 feet between members, and the lower gallery is available to members. Please identify yourself before you ask a question with mask on and not spending a lot of time together, as we may not recognize new members or older members, so please identify yourself before you ask the question. There are a limited number of paper copies of today's materials. If you are able to use the electronic versions online, we deeply appreciate that. For those of you who are participating via Zoom, please keep your cameras off and please stay muted. If you turn your camera on, you will be on the main screen. The boxes will shrink and it will be harder for members to see the material that's being presented. So please, we really appreciate you keeping your videos off. You can use the chat to ask presenters questions. Questions will be sent directly to the host to be read out loud and answered by the presenter. If you wish to ask a question and you are not able to do so through the chat, please email your question to Teresa. Her email address is tutton, T-U-T-T-O-N, @leg.state.vt.us.
And the speaker and I want to thank all the staff who have worked so hard, not only to make today possible, but all the evolving logistics as we've managed hybrid summer and fall committees. And as we prepare to begin another legislative session in the midst of a global pandemic. And so we just want to remind everybody, we're dealing with an unprecedented situation. We're all doing the best we can. We know you are doing the best that you can. Just bear with us as together we figure out the safest way forward. We also want to thank all of you for working with us through the uncertainty. We have a lot to do for Vermonters this session. And we have to keep our eyes and hearts focused on that. We can work together, but we're going to have to bring our best selves in order to do it. And I want to just go rogue for a minute and just thank our chiefs of staff, Carolyn Wesley, Connor Kennedy. They have been incredible this past year while we have tried to navigate this.
And it is now an honor to turn the podium over to our new Chief Fiscal Officer, Catherine Benham. Catherine, thanks again for all your hard work and your incredible staff. We are so fortunate. Welcome.
Give it up for Catherine Benham. Somebody will need it.
Thank you all. It is a pleasure to be here. We're excited that you all think fiscal issues are as interesting as we do. It's going to be an exciting day. We appreciate your patience. Again, we're going to try to do questions at the end. People on Zoom can send them in chat. People here can raise your hands. And anyway, just be patient as we figure this out. And I do want to thank everybody. The team's been working hard, but the IT team setting this up, doing the hybrid is a new adventure for all of us. So let's get started. Tom Cavett is the legislative economist. I think many of you, I've heard him talk before. He is going to be presenting on Zoom and going to be talking about revenues. So do you want to?
Okay, good morning, and good to be with you all, even in this weird hybrid virtual mode. And I think it's emblematic of what the economy is also dealing with, is this kind of uncertainty. 6 months ago, when we were last doing revenue analyses and forecast updates and the like, and meeting regularly with the Department of Financial Regulation, who analyzes epidemiological data that we use in the economic forecast, they were considering disbanding the operation altogether. All the contact tracing, all the personnel they had for that, caseloads looked like they were down to almost zero. Vaccinations were on the uptick. And here we are 6 months later, and we're still getting thrown curveballs by the epidemiological path of the pandemic, and that's a big part of what we'll be confronting in terms of the economic environment and how that affects revenues for the state. So I'm going to start a screen share here and go through some of the numbers and data that we're looking at with respect to the economy and revenues. We're just starting the January cycle of the economic review and revenue update. So we don't have anything new in terms of forecasts, but I'll give you a picture of where we stand relative to expectations on revenues and some of the economic developments that I think are going to influence changes to the January forecast, which will set the stage for revenues that would be assumed to be available during the session and for the fiscal year. So I will start the screen share now and see if this all works. Okay. Let me back up here just a second. We got. Okay, there's a lot swirling around in terms of things that are affecting the economy, and there are two things that are driving almost everything we're looking at in terms of the economic environment. The epidemiological path of the pandemic is front and center. I think that's been underscored by some of the recent fear about the Omicron variant and other variants that could be emerging. You saw the impact on the stock market just with the mention of it, where there was this dip. Oil prices, actually oil futures also went down, just, on the news of the possibility of another variant that could be problematic. We will continue to be whipsawed by what happens at the pandemic and obviously the responses to it. There are the federal fiscal and monetary policies in response to the pandemic we've talked about before, and they are enormous and really unprecedented. But there are now follow-up investments, notably the Infrastructure and Jobs Act that was just passed, and then the proposed Build Back Better programs that represent comparably huge fiscal policy commitments. They're not as stimulative because there are revenue offsets for lots of them, but not completely. But they are enormous in terms of the fiscal support that'll provide and shape the economic forecast in big ways. When we look at revenues to date, we're solidly ahead of targets, about 3.5% across all three major funds, almost 5% on the general fund, which is the largest. And that represents about $37 million. Some of that was booked early and may not be repeatable, had to do with some personal income effects from unemployment insurance and the like. But I think that a lot of it will flow into an adjustment to the revenue forecast in January. The three areas of strength have been personal income, corporate income, and meals and rooms. And there has been almost no category that's been below target. So those that are below are just slightly below, and then these three have been strong. And generally speaking, I think we're in a good position with respect to revenue through the year. The tourism, meals and rooms revenues are probably the most affected by the pandemic. And therefore, if there was some variant that caused economic impact, it would be showing up through that most immediately. And so that's obviously something we watch closely. The other thing about the meals and rooms receipts is with the pandemic, there was a big tilt towards short-term rentals like Airbnb, and that has continued. So we've been getting a lot of tourism spending, but it's not all in the same places that it used to be. Same with restaurant revenues. There's still an enormous amount of business in drive-through and restaurants that have had outdoor dining when the weather was good. There are shifts, and a lot of these pandemic shifts will persist, and a lot of them will be temporary phenomenon, and we're still sorting through all that. But I think the fact that there has been a resurgence with the Delta wave is something that has worked to our advantage to some extent, because air travel has been perceived as being more problematic and more of a hassle. And the fact that you can drive to Vermont from so many places, there's roughly 50 million people within about a 5-hour drive of Vermont, has brought a lot of tourism to the state, and meals and rooms has benefited from that. The sales and use tax is pretty much right on target, but it and the motor vehicle purchase and use tax probably would have been higher had there been more things to consume. I think it's most apparent with purchase and use when you look at some of the car dealerships and just look at the lots. Many of them are empty or much smaller. So that's limiting tax receipts to some extent. We'll talk about inflation later. I'm not going to do a deep dive into the economy at large, but just want to touch on three areas of particular concern: housing and real estate, inflation, and labor markets. But more inflation, which is what we're going to be getting, will generally flow through to higher tax receipts because most of the taxes are, the consumption taxes are ad valorem. But there are some that are based on physical volume, particularly transportation fuel taxes, portion of that, that will be negatively affected by inflation. So both property transfer taxes and sales use, which had huge increases in the forecast, are close to expectations. Some months a little below, some months a little above, but very close. And I'll spend some time talking about real estate in a moment. The epidemiological issues, as we've talked about for a long time, we're spending as much time with statistical data on epidemiology as we are with economic statistics. And it's an incredibly difficult thing to forecast. We've looked at some of the advisors to DFR that are trying to track, analyze, and project what might happen. The confidence intervals around the forecasts that are produced are huge. And it's a lot of times the answer is simply, we don't know. So it's a question of responding to what develops as it develops and processing that. Case rates in the state have never been worse, but the vaccination, the level of vaccinations has clearly reduced both hospitalizations and deaths relative to the case numbers. It's per capita rates of infection are about 5 times more likely among unvaccinated people, and hospitalization and deaths are about 13 times more likely. These stats vary by region and point in time. I think the latest DFR data is actually a little bit higher than that, but there's no question that the vaccinations have mitigated to some extent some of the worst impacts of the Delta variant of late. There was a study by Kaiser Family Foundation and Peterson that estimated losses, avoidable losses, and costs for healthcare for unvaccinated persons. They estimated $6 billion between June and August of 2021. And if you take those same rates forward, it would be something like $15 billion by the end of the year. So some of the stats that are of most important, this is the US chart of reported cases, testing, hospitalizations, and deaths. And you can see that the Delta wave here was pronounced, dropped down, and it's really shifted from region to region, because in warmer months, some of the states where people went indoors because of air conditioning created more spread, and it shifted more to northern states now where cold weather is bringing people indoors, and that seems to be a big part of the spread. When we look at it in Vermont, and this is true of the region in general, there are some states that are a little better, some that are worse. You can see the case rate is extremely high. Hospitalizations also higher than they had been, but considerably lower relative to the case rate, and deaths also considerably lower than the case rate surge. So hospitalizations are the thing that we're really looking at, because it's the stress on healthcare systems that causes governments to take more severe actions to try to minimize the possibility of being overwhelmed in terms of healthcare. healthcare providers. We're looking particularly at critical care usage, ICU beds, and you can see all those metrics are getting worse and worse. It's not a complete crisis, but there are regional medical facilities, not Vermont, but in New England, that are in worse shape, and you can see that this is pretty tight. This is a real concern. The other thing that's a concern is the positivity rate. This is now up a little above 5%, which was kind of a red line used before as being a metric that would trigger further action, but it's an indication there's a lot of community spread, and so that is of concern. When you look at case rates across the state by county, it will change from period to period, but you'll see areas, clusters, outbreaks, things that move around the state. It's all over. It's also clear that the economic impacts of that situation of really here's the worst epidemiological stats we've seen in the state, but we're not seeing the same negative economic impacts. So people are learning to live with it, to understand risks better, and it doesn't result in the same level of economic contraction. And we're seeing that in meals and rooms with the tourism visitation, and we're seeing it in other metrics too. This is a series that we developed with GMP and other utilities in the state in the first month or two of the pandemic, and they very generously provided data and analysis and information that help us understand how people are actually behaving with respect to where they're working and where they're spending money and where they're going and the like. This is electricity consumption, and it's daily data starting back in March of 2020. The black line shows a normalized actual expected rate of energy consumption, in this case from residential customers. And you can see that, weekends normally are where you expect to get spikes in residential consumption. And the red line is what actually demand was from residential customers. So you can see from the onset of the pandemic, there's been more residential electricity consumption, and that's narrowed a bit here, but that's largely persisted. When we look though at small commercial industrial, and that's sort of the bulk of the a lot of the business commerce. There's industrial also, but that tends to be to me more volatile. But you can see here how much less small commercial and industrial electricity was being used early on. These are businesses that are closed, shorter hours, all the rest, and even in this period when things were a little bit better, it was still quite a bit lower. When you start to get into 2021 and vaccinations start to take hold, case rates drop, you see a return to something very close to what a baseline would be, and then even some growth in that baseline. And even with the resurgence of the Delta wave, that's still we're still seeing a lot more activity. So the economic effects are muted, and I think that would be true of a variant like Omicron that unless there were much more severe healthcare impacts from that, higher risk of hospitalization or death. So anyway, that's the in terms of the linkage to the economy, that's an important point. The other big area that obviously is influencing the economy is the massive amount of federal spending that's occurred both fiscal, monetary policy. And there are a set of policies that we've talked about before that have to do with responses to the pandemic. Those haven't changed a whole lot since the last time we presented this. There's been a little bit more spending, but not much. But it's massive, and it just because it's been initiated doesn't mean it's hit the economy. To the extent that a great deal of the money that was dispersed to individuals and firms has been saved, it's still on the sidelines and can enter the economy and will and has entered the economy in lots of different ways and will continue to. So that's important to recognize just in terms of timing. On top of all of that, there are two major fiscal policy programs that you'll be hearing more about later that are very important. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which as proposed was bigger, but still 1.2 trillion is very large, and about half of that 550 billion is new spending. And it is largely, a lot of it is funded with additional revenues, but not all of it. And so that will be a stimulative measure. And the Build Back Better Act, much smaller deficit impact, out of the House at something like north of 2 trillion. It depends, a lot of it depends on how some of the things are measured, but it's likely to be more like maybe 1.7, 1.8 billion, depending on exactly what happens in the Senate. But it's enormous. It's hard to wrap your head around the magnitude of these numbers. And when you see it flow into the economy, there are a lot of unpredictable ways that it flows and moves around, but it's going to be affecting the economy and revenues for quite a while to come. Vermont, as we've said before, gets an outsized share of this. It looks like just on the pandemic transfer payments, we're over $10 billion. Per capita basis, latest run on that is about 16,000 per capita, which is the third highest in the nation. That's true of a lot of different programs. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as signed, we don't know the exact state split outs because some of the money is allocated by formula and some of it's via grants that you need to apply for. I would just say if there needs to be an allocation of funding to support lots of grant writing from Vermont, that's money very well spent. The funding that could come in as a result of this bill is massive and will have huge beneficial impacts for the state. To the extent we know some of the things that are likely to fall by state and can characterize those, looks like Vermont will be getting somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.3 or 2.4 billion, 3,710 per capita. Also probably, up towards the top of the states in the nation, fifth highest probably in that regard. So this is also very important to the economy. The Build Back Better Act, there are a lot of moving parts to it. It's also enormous, has a lot of different spending components, and we'll know more about that as it works its way through the Senate, and we'll see if what passes, what it'll be, but there's more on the way. So I think that's important to understand, and we will probably assume something like $1.7 trillion at the federal level for this, and then we'll have to work through the thousands of pages on it to try to see what actually is coming to the state. So all of this sets up the economy in 2022 to grow at very rapid rates. If the pandemic recedes, or we simply deal with it in ways that are not as disruptive, we could be seeing nominal dollar GDP growth of nearly 10%, which in Vermont would be the highest we've seen since 1989. We're also going to see higher and more persistent inflation, probably 4 to 5% CPI growth both this year and next, which is double what had been expected 6 months ago. That's going to be focused in different areas, and we'll talk briefly about some of that in a minute. The other thing that's occurring, and housing is also on the agenda today, is it now is evident that that real estate markets are entering what is the third major cyclical upswing in the past 40 years, with home price gains in double digits likely in 2022. We've seen 2 such quarters in 2021, and we only have data through the third quarter of 2021. But with interest rates low, capital plentiful, a long period of underinvestment in new housing, all the ingredients are in place for record price growth until supply catches up or incomes falter, which typically take a few years to resolve. So that's a big shift. There are big implications for the education fund because the valuations of property are going up with this. That is the signal, to markets for supply to kick into high gear. And we saw in the third quarter of this year, price increases for homes increased by 17.7%. The quarter before was over 12%. That last quarter number is the highest that we've ever had, and this goes back early 80s. Solid data on that, stable data on that. So that is a phenomena that will have wide-ranging impacts and is important to watch. One of the unusual characteristics about this real estate cycle is that normally residential and non-residential building move in similar ways. A lot of the same things affect one as the other, but there are several non-residential commercial categories that won't be sharing in the upswing. Office, retail, and hotel, motel, construction and valuations will be subdued. But still, a big part of the real estate market in Vermont is residential, and that's going up at very rapid rates in terms of prices. Some of the other effects of the pandemic, it's hard to say how permanent they're going to be, but we've definitely had some beneficial impacts in terms of positive net migration. It is hard to get firm numbers on this, and we're looking at it from a lot of different angles, looking at tax returns, addresses, new taxpayers through that, postal data on address changes, temporary and permanent address changes, this sort of thing, school enrollments. It doesn't look like it's gigantic at this point, but it doesn't take a whole lot to be meaningfully positive, and I think it's in that category for sure. The ability to work remotely and the investment in broadband could have enormous potential economic development impacts for the state. So those are big changes that could be important going forward, and we'll be monitoring closely. Some of the negative effects are in the labor force, and we've seen a lot of early retirement, and we have an older population than most states. So, and also a wealthier older population than most states. So earlier retirement, it's unclear now if some of those workers may come back into the labor force, but we've had a big drop in labor force participation, and so that's a downside. When we look at what's happening with investment flows and potentially market bubbles and ultimately what's affecting real estate, you can see the enormous increases in equity market prices. Stock market run-up is extraordinary, highly vulnerable to downside at this point. When you look at margin accounts and the like, leveraged money that's in the market, there's a potential for real unraveling if bad things start to happen. But so far, it's just been up, up, up. Another indicator of risk in and bubble propensity is shown in really what's not investment, but entertainment, really more than anything, both with meme stock investments and crypto. There have been enormous increases here, and both this and and the gains in the stock market. If you look at these sort of gains, these are enormous potential tax liabilities if and when people realize gains. So if there's selling that occurs in this, and there are a lot of different ways that could happen, there could be a change in a capital gains tax rate at the federal level, which would prompt selling. There could just be also a market correction in which there's a lot of selling, but there could be a lot of unrealized capital gains that become realized, and that would affect tax revenues. Bitcoin is trying hard, other crypto, to avoid anybody knowing what those gains are, but more and more their regulatory involvement that will be trying to capture that legally. Those are also potential tax liabilities. When we look at real estate markets, there's a chart that I show in almost every forecast that looks at what's happening in the real estate cycle by state. And it's based on FHFA data, which is the best regional data. It's timely. Here's what we're seeing with that. I'm going to start first with third quarter 2021 versus the third quarter of 2020. So this is the latest data. Every single state in the nation saw double-digit price increases, with the exception of DC, Louisiana, and North Dakota. Vermont's here at 17.7%. The other New England and New York states are in pink. They're kind of all over the map, but very solid gains across the board. Some of the Mountain West states have had the biggest increases, and they've been getting them for some time. So in terms of crash, that's going to be some of the steepest drops when this drops off. Let's go forward and just look at the same data. So this is percent change relative to the last cyclical peak, which is the pink line, and relative to the last cyclical trough. So if you bought a house at the last peak, the pink lines show how much more it would be worth now. In Vermont, about 30% more. And if you bought it at the trough, it shows how much more it'd be worth. In Vermont, 42%. In some states like Nevada, if you bought at the trough, it would be 179% more valuable. But every single state now is at valuations that exceed the prior cyclical peak. This is the first quarter for which that's been true. So this is a market that is starting to build. There have been, as I said, 3 major real estate cycles over the last 40 years. This is the third that we're entering. This is the year-over-year change in the same housing price index in Vermont. And typically different regions of the country move in different ways. New England had a very similar picture with a little bit different timing among the states, but the same picture pretty much. a big cycle here in the late 1980s with a crash in the early 1990s. Another big cycle running up to the Great Recession with big gains through about 2006-07, and then a crash here, an extended period of underinvestment, a buildup. This is an old forecast, but it just shows we were expecting another surge to occur. There were a lot of elements there. The pandemic has kind of supercharged that. So this is important because it is closely related to the grand list valuations upon which the education fund tax rate runs. So this is where we're at right now. The last bar is the last actual data point. This is very much looking bubble-like, and bubbles are not something that you forecast with fundamentals. It's largely, the fundamentals are in place for a big surge, but what will make this bubble are psychological and behavioral actions that occur now. It could be much higher. Higher it goes, the farther it's going to drop. So this is the only thing, just in terms of balancing the economics of it. It goes up like this, you're going to have a period like this afterwards. And so we're in the early stages of it. We're watching it closely, but that's developing. Huge home price increases we're seeing. And it's also not just in the Burlington area. This is a chart that shows the same thing, the price indices. These are levels now. This is an index number. But you can see that they moved kind of in tandem historically. This breakout only goes back to 1996, but you can see those, increase roughly comparable ways. In the last period, the Great Recession and its aftermath, the Burlington metro area grew much more quickly than the rest of the state. And this was true with a lot of urban areas nationally. But since recently, there's been more growth in the non-MSA areas during the pandemic, particularly resort type areas. If we look at just commercial construction starts reflecting a lot of this, if calendar year 2020 % change versus 5-year average from 2015 to 19, and you use a long-term average because this is a noisy series. There's 1 or 2 projects can make it fluctuate a lot, but overall store and restaurant construction's down 85%, office and bank down 54%, garage and service stations 66%, hotel motel construction, there's virtually no new construction started. There was a little bit of renovation and such, but not a lot of new construction. And to the extent that that's moving more towards an Airbnb type thing, you're seeing what are really residential buildings being used for commercial purposes. Warehouse construction was the only big winner in commercial construction in Vermont in 2020, up more than 100%. Also, when we look at the split between single family and multifamily, this is the share of new dwelling units in Vermont. Historically has been pretty heavily tilted towards single family, but in the last decade or so, moving much closer to 50-50. Then with the onset of the pandemic, it's really pushed those spreads apart, a much higher preference for single family than apartments. Just a few quick words on inflation because we're running a little bit short on time and I want to have a little bit of time for Q&A, but big changes in inflation. We deconstruct this in a lot of different ways. This is just a chart showing long-term history for perspective. It's important to note that there are 300 some odd components that go into the CPI. And when you look at them, there are a lot of individual stories for all of them. The numbers that are reported are typically year over year. And because of the pandemic, it skewed a lot of those year-to-year comparisons. So you're comparing it in some cases to things that went down and then have surged back up. Used cars and trucks are some of the biggest ones. The the way that I prefer to look at it is to go pre-pandemic, which is 2019, and then start running out changes from there. Because then you can see those that dropped and are just coming back, or those that went up and stayed up. So anyway, that's I think a more comprehensive way to look at it. And it's one of the reasons that we will see rates of inflation slow a bit. It's not going to keep accelerating. I think November will be more like 7%. So there could be a few more months like that. But I think markets will tend to resolve some of this because money will flow to the areas that have the biggest price increases, and in time those adjust. Also, you have a lot of the increase coming from energy price changes, and that too is moderating when you look at future prices for various energy sources. But when you look at year over year, which is a blue line, you can get something like a 60% increase in fuel oil. And yet, if you look at it on an annualized basis over a 2-year period, so you're going back to the pre-pandemic level, it's, more like 6-7%. That's still not great. This is for the category that's, has the biggest increase. Across all the categories, and these don't list all of them, but just sort of have representative samples, you can see that there's a lot of variation by component of that. And if you look at energy prices long-term on a real basis, we're at about $80 here. But again, it's coming from the absolute lowest real dollar, constant dollar value for crude oil on record. So all the way back 69, prices fell because consumption dropped, and as they recover their startup. Also, a lot of U.S. producers went out of business. That was by design from OPEC, and they're not yet fully back in. So that there's a time response to deal with that, but that's just a perspective. I'm not going to spend too much more time with this, but labor market's another big area that we're looking at. Changes in, again, as I mentioned, the labor force has been shrinking with the pandemic, and it's still not clear how much of that will be temporary and how much will be permanent. There are job gains that are occurring. I think in 2022, we'll see recovery at the national level back to pre-pandemic levels. It'll take longer in Vermont, but unemployment rates are way down. The latest U.S. number was 4.2%, and in Vermont, 2.8%, still a little higher than pre-pandemic, but solid progress. Vermont's 4th lowest in the United States and lowest in the region. Job openings now exceed the number unemployed, which again was a pre-pandemic phenomenon, but is a rare event. That also, there's a lot of job mismatch, but that's also a sign of just how tight labor markets are, and you're seeing it in wage increases. And even with higher inflation, a lot of those wage increases do represent real wage increases, so adjusted for inflation wage increases. And we have seen some recovery in what's an equivalent participation rate, which is employment to population ratio for ages 25 to 54. This is the metric the Fed looks at in evaluating labor force participation. When that gets up above around 80%, that's considered sort of full employment level. So it's moving that way. So this is one of the few Greek letters that's easy to get a font for, because it's Omicron is just the letter O, and there's a lot that's unknown about it. It's not clear where it's going to go, but obviously needs to be tracked. I just think it's probably not going to be as damaging, but it just shows the uncertainty that persists, And we need to recognize that going forward and adjust economic forecasts and revenue forecasts and all the rest accordingly. So I'll open it up to Q&A. Teresa, I'm not sure how you want to do questions, but anyway, I will stop the screen share and take questions from anybody.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, Representative Helm, do you want to identify yourself just because? Just, can you use your microphone?
Yes, this is Representative Helm. Yeah, Tom, you know, in my district, I get more questions from people on a day-to-day basis. And it's a little bit out of my level, but the question basically is, how much debt is the federal government owed or owing to wherever the debt is incurred on a collective basis? What they're looking for is they hear about billions, they hear about trillions, they go on the internet and you hear about stimulus packages every day, different ones. I don't know if they materialized or where they went, but my point is I cannot put an accurate total dollar on it, or what's more important, the amount of time and energy and resources of different kinds will we have to produce over the next whatever amount of time to pay our debt. And that's what I'd like to be able to report to them. It's a federal level, of course. But you mentioned it halfway through here on one of the pages. I give you the page number, but I don't have a page number. So I don't know if you can give me some type of a sane answer I can give my constituents. I can't just throw numbers at them. I just don't do that.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you it's 23.3 trillion, but again, wrapping your head around that is a hard thing to do. So, you know, and what does it mean? Okay, that's a staggeringly large number, but it's important to understand that it is largely held by us. So it is money that we owe ourselves, and it can be, you know, it can be paid in a lot of different ways. So again, the debt costs are something that flow into the budget. The actual debt level is, you know, just sort of carried. As long as interest rates are really low, federal government can borrow very cheaply. The interest costs aren't huge, but over time, that's a big drag on the economy. So near term, very stimulative. Longer term, it's going to weigh on economic growth, and that's a negative. So it is a very real concern. You know, that's the number, but I think it's a hard thing to describe. The same way I think it's hard to digest. Even when I say 10 billion came just from pandemic relief support to the state of Vermont, that's just a massive number, and it's like nothing we've seen, you know, before. Hope that helps.
What I'm going to do
That's
next.
okay, I guess. Thank you.
Well, any follow-up, I'm happy to respond to.
Okay, I'm going to go to a chat, somebody from remote. Representative Jessup asked, Tom, you mentioned a rise in early retirement. Was it focused in a particular sector, and how much percentage-wise of it is the state employee workforce? Do you know?
No, it's that's mostly anecdotal information. We don't have clear hard data on that. So all we see is loss in labor force. So that's labor force participation. So there's people who are saying they're not looking for work. They were previously employed, but they're now not looking for work. But that can be a lot of different reasons. And so we don't have good stats at the state level on exactly what that share is. We just know there are a number by survey data. We know there are things that people list as being reasons: fear of getting sick, care for elderly or children or other dependents, particularly during the pandemic, illness themselves, long COVID kind of effects, that sort of thing, or retirement, or they're just, stopping working. So we're going to get more and more data, but I don't have a hard number on that. It's just anecdotally that's mentioned, and given the fact that we have an older labor force, that's likely part of what's going on.
Is there another chat from somebody who's in the room? A question? Yes.
Yes, good morning. Great presentation. One question I have is if the pandemic or the recovery has had any effect in the available credit, consumer credit, or the outstanding mortgage balances in Vermont.
And just for those of you who are not here, that was Representative Sibilia.
Yeah, I don't have data on Vermont specific, but nationally, there was a big pay down in credit card debt that came with a lot of the stimulus money. So a lot of what the holders of that debt, which are basically lower income households, a lot of the federal pandemic relief money that wasn't urgently required for day-to-day expenses was used to pay down debt. That created more capacity for borrowing, and that's being used to some extent now. There's some interesting data that just was released by the Federal Reserve on checking account balances by income class, and it's showing that the biggest increases in checking account balances came from low income households. In large part, that's due to the fact that higher income households don't put excess funds in checking accounts. They're more apt to invest them. But it also shows the speed with which they get drawn down at the low income levels. So we're seeing now still lower levels of debt, so there's more capacity, but once again, borrowing starting to happen. So there has been an improvement in debt as a result of federal monies.
I'm going to go back to somebody who's sent in a chat. Representative Mulvaney Stanek asked, is the state tracking population migration by region and or other data points based on employers, Vermont-based versus out-of-state, and household income? Also, are we able to track the cause of migration, pandemic versus climate change versus something else?
Oh, I wish there were good stats on that already. Believe me, we've been banging every door and every wall to try to get numbers to fall out. But we've approached it from a lot of different sources. As I said, we're looking at tax department data, tax filings. Those are good because they cover a lot of filers, but you don't always know what the population effects from that are, because you have one filer and then you have dependents that you're counting. Presumably that would be close to population, but there are reasons that that's not a universe count. So we'll get 2020 census data, but that's not really going to give us a lot on pandemic effects. So that will shift the baseline somewhat. School enrollments are another one, but again, you're just counting children and children that are not being taught at home or in schools that we don't have enrollment data on. So we don't have the kind of hard data yet on that. There's some data from the post office that we got on address changes, showed that throughout New England there were a lot more changes in rural areas than in net positive changes in rural areas and suburban areas than in the metropolitan areas, which is what you'd expect. So this has been, we have a lot of anecdotal information, but in terms of hard counts and what does that add up to, it's still not entirely clear. We're still trying to get at some of this data.
We have a few more questions, but I'm also mindful of the time. So why don't we do 2 or 3? And you had a question there.
Thank you very much. Peter Anthony from Barry City. I want to go back to your reference to bubbles and the inevitability that you referred to. Our community has yet to recover from the housing bubble, and yet it's at least 8 years old. I'm wondering if there isn't some advice or thought to what the state could do, not for its own sake, but in light of the situation which may befall many local communities who heretofore do not depend on the state, and regularly there's no, if you will, assistance program from the state to the local communities. The housing bubble has in fact impacted at the local level more severely than it did at the state level, interestingly enough. And so I'm just a bit worried of what may be asked, if you will, as a local representative when that bubble occurs. It may start in housing, it looks like it will, but no two bubbles are alike. And thank you for any advice you have.
Yeah, so you rightly point out that housing is a very local market. I mean, in real estate, you know, they say location, location, location. It's, you know, in one market can be a terrible market, and one street corner can still be a great address and a property that's appreciating way above those around it. But in aggregate, you can look at areas that are economically connected, and those tend to be markets that move in tandem. So, but those are also very local. And, you know, just that chart on the Burlington MSA and the rest of the state shows the kind of split that you can get in certain periods of time. And then the pandemic is also showing, you know, what can happen in the other direction as well. There are winners and losers in bubble situations. So when housing prices go up, it improves the equity position of everybody who owns a house now. You know, in terms of taxation, if expenditures are not going up, you know, rapidly, you will, or as rapidly as the prices, which in this kind of situation will not be happening. I don't think you're going to get a double-digit increase in you know, the activity that's funding. You will see tax rates actually drop, but the actual tax bill will still be going up relative to the expenditures. But it's a plus in terms of the equity for people who hold houses and want to sell them. That's, you know, that's a plus. It's harder for people who are trying to get into the market the first time and whose incomes are not growing at double-digit rates. And that's the mismatch that occurs. So it's, you know, when you talk about a bubble, it you know, it can work out well for, you know, some part of it. It's a price signal that indicates an imbalance, but it gets fueled a lot of times by rushes of money that come in. It becomes self-fulfilling. People see price going up, they want to get in before interest rates go up. Even when interest rates start going up, they see the value of the house going up, so they can still borrow. Then those that sell them are making money, and they talk about it. And people say, oh yeah, let's flip houses. That's a great way to make money. Well, that works for a little while. Then it just can't be supported with income levels that exist. And then it crashes on the other end. So it tends to be, you tend to get more extreme bubbles in real estate because the supply response takes a long time. You have to buy land, you have to permit stuff, and you have to actually build something before new supply is on the market. And that lag is a period in which you can get a big run up in prices. And then a lot of times the construction also doesn't stop on a dime. So a lot of things that are planned are built out after the markets drop, and it creates more whipsaw than in other markets. I could go into this in detail if there's specific areas of it that you're interested in, but the bubble's not uniformly bad. They're winners and losers in it.
In the interest of time, I'm going to do one more question that's on the chat, and then we will, if you have questions, we can email them to Teresa or ask JFO, and we can also get more information back to you later. But from Representative Austin, how have costs increased or decreased for Vermonters who previously worked on site and who now work remotely? and now have to incur costs for fuel and electricity at home, but maybe saving on commuting costs?
Yeah, well, that would vary by individual depending on their circumstances, but I think in general, remote work would be once you've invested in the equipment and space to do that reasonably well, then your costs are lower because you're not, you're not spending the fuel and commuting, and also apparel. You'll see that apparel prices are still below pre-pandemic levels. And more so in men's clothing than women's. I don't know what that's about, but it is cheaper to work remotely. And I think it's not just a price thing, but I think a lot of workers have found that to be advantageous for other reasons, time with family, various other things. And that is likely to be something that to some degree really persists, and will be a feature of future economy, and is a plus for Vermont because, remote work for highly paid individuals can create job opportunities in the state that didn't exist before.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you. I know there are a lot more questions. Please send them to the Joint Fiscal Office again, Teresa, or ask jfo@leg.state.bt.us, and we will pass them on to Tom. Thank you, Tom, for your help and presentation on this.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
So next, Maria Beliveau and Sarah Clark will talk about the budget. Maria, I think many of you know, is the key fiscal office staff person in the House Appropriations Committee. Sarah Clark is also going to be a very familiar face to you. She's worked in a variety of different state agencies, but she now has a new role in the Joint Fiscal Office as the deputy. We're thrilled to have her on board, and she will be working also as part of the budget team. Oh, one last thing. I've been asked to remind you, everyone, to please keep your masks on. Thank you.
Hello and welcome. As Catherine mentioned, I'm Maria Beliveau and I work for the Joint Fiscal Office. Sarah Clark and I will be presenting this next segment on the FY22 budget as passed last May, then looking forward to the FY23 budget and finishing with a discussion on federal funding. Before I start, I'd like to make a plug for the Joint Fiscal Office website where you can find these slides as well as information to back up the material that you'll hear about today. You can access it through the legislative website or directly. It is quick, easy, and you won't be disappointed. So I'm going to see if I can use my clicker. Oh, so far, not good.
Don't hold it down. Just.
Okay, maybe you can do it for me. How about that? Okay, so we're going to get the assistance of Teresa. And if we could just move to the next slide. Okay, so first I'm going to provide you with information on the source of funds that support the budget, and then a summary of how the funds are being spent in fiscal 22, the current fiscal year. Then I'll review the current thinking on the budget that will be developed this coming session for fiscal year 2023. And finally, as mentioned, Sarah will discuss federal pandemic and non-pandemic funds with you. So if we could move to the next slide, Teresa. You just heard from Tom Gavette about the projected revenues that the FY22 budget is based upon. In addition, you heard about the projected revenues that will support the fiscal 23 budget. As you know, the revenue forecast is an essential part of the information used to build the budget, since the budget has to be balanced, not overspending available revenues. This slide shows you how total funds in the current FY22 budget were appropriated. In fiscal 22, the budget, as passed last May, totaled $7.3 billion. This includes federal funds of almost $2.8 billion. As you can see in the large blue box to the left, the federal fund appropriations include $482 million of ARPA funds. Together, the federal funds represent 38% of the total budget. That's the single largest source of funds. The fiscal 22 budget represents the second year in a row that the total state budget exceeds $7 billion, and that's due to the federal COVID relief funds. So if we could move to the next slide. This slide doesn't include federal funds and shows where the state funds are appropriated in fiscal 22. Without the federal funds, it's the general fund that represents the largest share of spending at 43%, followed closely by education fund spending at 41%. The pre-K through 12 education spending in this chart includes the net education property tax, which is the total education property tax less the property tax credit. So it's the amount the property owners actually pay. The special funds make up 9% of the state funds in the budget and are mostly targeted to support specific activities. Finally, the transportation and transportation infrastructure bond funds account for 7% of state funds in the current year budget. The next slide. This fourth slide shows how both state funds and federal funds were appropriated in the fiscal 22 budget by category. Queuing off the prior slide, state funds include general funds, education funds, special funds, and transportation funds. You can see that the two biggest categories of state fund expenditures are Medicaid and pre-K through 12 education. Additionally, Medicaid is where the largest amount of federal funds is appropriated. Off to the right are two bars that show one-time general fund and federal fund spending, including ARPA and some general funds and some federal funds. The pre-K through 12 education bar shows all pre-K through 12 expenditures that are in the education function of government, including things such as teachers' retirement and the cost of administration within the agency of education, among other things. This chart reflects education-related expenditures that are in addition to the net education property tax number that you saw on the second and third chart of this presentation. This number includes expenditures supported by the sales tax, a portion of the meals and rooms tax, and purchase and use tax, in addition to a few other sources. So if we can move to the next slide. An alternative way to view the budget is by looking at expenditures categorized by state employees, operating expenses, and grants and contracts that are issued by the state. As you can see, grants and contracts represent 74% of the funds appropriated in the budget. These are funds that go out to local communities, organizations, and service providers, such as healthcare, financial support for low-income people, elderly or disabled Vermonters, and road construction and federal funds for COVID relief, among other things. The amount spent on the payroll for state employees is 13% of the budget, and another 13% is used to support operating expenses of state government for things such as fee-for-space, office supplies, IT hardware and software, payments to the Agency of Digital Service, furniture and fixtures, as well as many other things. We move to the next slide. This slide focuses on where the largest commitments of general fund dollars live in the budget. The total general fund appropriation in FY22 is $1.95 billion. This chart shows the appropriations where almost 66% of the general fund spending occurs. As you can see, the Medicaid spending figure of $675 million represents approximately 35% of all general fund spending. This does not include the federal share that Vermont receives from Medicaid. Second place goes to other parts of the Agency of Human Services, followed by teachers' retirement, the Department of Corrections, and debt service. Most of these funds are spent on things that the state is obligated to pay for, restricting the amount of general funds available to support the remainder of state government. The next slide, describes the difference between base funds and one-time funds. You'll often hear revenue and expenditures described as base and one-time. This slide defines what we are referring to when we talk about base revenues that are used to support base expenditures and one-time revenues that are used to support one-time expenditures. When revenues are referred to as base, they are part of the official revenue forecast each year. And because of that, they can be used to support ongoing programs and operations of state government. One-time funds are just that, funds that we anticipate to only have for 1 year. They are non-recurring and come from things such as court settlements and special fund balances. Occasionally, these revenues are collected by the state due to one-time events, such as the CRF and ARPA funds that the states received in response to the COVID-19 epidemic. You will see in the next slide that we are anticipating having significant one-time funds at the end of fiscal 22. One-time funds are generally spent on one-time expenditures to make sure that the expenditures do not have ongoing funding obligations into the future. Examples of one-time expenditures include capital improvements, shoring up special funds that are having a temporary shortfall, equipment purchases, IT projects, and reserves. We can move to the next slide. Each year, the staff of the Joint Fiscal Office and the administration sit down and discuss what the anticipated budget pressures may be for the coming year, as well as available revenues. This discussion represents a point in time and may change as we receive the updated official revenue forecast in January 2022 and learn more about the pressures on the budget. It appears that when the FY23 budget is developed, there will be some available unallocated base funds after addressing some of the budget pressures. This is a somewhat unusual situation and will be addressed by both the Governor and the General Assembly. Currently, it is projected that the growth rate in the general fund beyond 23 will not continue to be as strong as it is now. We will learn more about available base funds once the official revenue forecast is presented in January. In addition, there is anticipated to be significant unallocated one-time funds available at the end of fiscal 22. Some of one-time funds will be used to support the governor's requested FY22 budget adjustment bill. However, it is more than likely that there will be a significant carry forward of one-time general funds into fiscal year 2023. Currently, we anticipate there being about $188 million one-time general funds available, and that's before the budget adjustment bill is considered. There's also $528 million of unallocated ARPA funds that are still to be appropriated. So clearly, due to the available state and federal one-time funds, we can anticipate a lively and robust conversation about how to allocate them this coming session. Yeah. Could we move to the next slide, please? Okay. Year in and year out, there are some typical pressures that must be addressed in the budget. These sorts of pressures include unfunded liabilities such as pensions and OPEB, caseload pressures in the Agency of Human Services, the cost of Pay Act and rolling out the Pay Act increase from the prior year into the base, state operations, and initiatives of the Governor and the General Assembly. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, so this slide lists some of the pressures on the FY23 budget that we can identify at this point in time. We anticipate that there may be other things added to this list as we get closer to finalizing the FY23 budget. The pressures are separated with base pressures on the left-hand column and one-time pressures in the right-hand column. Some of the identified base pressures are familiar, such as Medicaid, pensions, and OPEB. There are some pressures specific to the pandemic, including the courts, which had to close to the public and will incur costs associated with reopening. In addition to spending in the budget, due to the available unallocated base revenues anticipated in 23, there may be some proposals related to tax expenditures. Higher education will more than likely have increased base funding requests. One-time general fund and federal fund investments that the General Assembly may consider include some things listed on the right-hand side of the slide. These are issues that you've considered before, and they continue to need resources. As noted on the slide, economic development, housing, climate change, clean water, broadband, childcare, higher education, and required funds to match federal funds will all be issues that come before the General Assembly. So if we can move to the next slide, Teresa. The state of Vermont has made progress putting money away in reserve funds. Currently, in FY22, the stabilization reserve in the transportation fund is $13.9 million, which represents the full 5% reserve required by statute. The general fund also has a full stabilization reserve representing 5% of the prior year's appropriation. In addition, there is $80.4 million in the rainy day reserve, also at the 5% statutory level. This is also referred to in statute as a general fund balance reserve. There is $97.7 million in the human service caseload reserve. So this brings the general fund reserve total to $265.2 million, which represents 13.6% of general fund spending in fiscal '22. How much is enough? There is ongoing discussion about how much money should be in our reserve funds and how much is enough. This is an important issue, especially during years when money is scarce and reserves become very important. Now I'm going to turn things over to Sarah Clark, who will present information on federal funds.
Good morning. I'm pleased to join you here in the chamber of the Vermont House today. For those of you who don't know me, I most recently worked at the Agency of Human Services. And as I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the federal funding related to the pandemic and non-pandemic, I can tell you that over the last 18 months at the Agency of Human Services, our federal funding picture continually evolved. And I expect that as a nation and as a state, we will see the same going forward. Teresa, can you move to the next slide, please? Building off of Tom Cvette's presentation, federal funds continue to be significant and flow to the states. At JFO, we are closely monitoring the federal funding situation in the state of Vermont. Vermont has benefited greatly from small state minimums. As Tom indicated, we are the third highest per capita recipient of pandemic funding at roughly $16,000 per Vermonter. In addition, for some of the direct to state aid sources, such as the Coronavirus Relief Fund, Vermont was the second highest at roughly $2,000 per capita from the Coronavirus Relief Fund. Those types of funds to Vermont have allowed us not only to effectively respond to the pandemic, but to be able to make some significant investments in the future of Vermont. There are limitations on the use of the federal funds depending on the source. Some of them are targeted for specific purposes. And we are now starting to see that state match is required on some funds, for example, within the transportation realm. One of the interesting areas at the Agency of Human Services and across state government, this Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Emergency Management Assistant FEMA funds. When we started this pandemic, there was a requirement of state match of roughly 25%. However, as we've moved through the pandemic, those funds have shifted to 100% federal funding, which has been of great assistance as it's one of our primary funders of the pandemic response for both testing and vaccination. What we're starting to see more recently is more of a return to normal as it relates to federal funding, meaning that the federal government is increasing existing grant programs through increased allotments to support programs of Vermont, as well as we're moving to more of a longer term timeframe away from what we saw with the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which was a significant infusion of cash to be spent over a relatively short period of time. Moving on to the next slide, we see federal funding both specific to the pandemic, and we're starting to see more non-pandemic recovery-related funding. For pandemic specific purposes, Vermont has received an allocation of roughly $10 billion. That is split into two categories, $5 billion for grant funding, much of which flows through state government, and another $5 billion of non-grant funding, which primarily flows direct to recipients to benefit them. Within the grant $5 billion. Some examples of that include direct state aid, such as the Coronavirus Relief Fund and the state and local fiscal recovery funds, as well as the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. In the non-grant direct to recipients category, this includes things like the Paycheck Protection Program, unemployment compensation, as well as the American Rescue Plan Act economic impact payments to all Vermonters. In the non-pandemic realm, as Tom discussed, and Marcia from the Federal Funds Information for the States will provide some more details. We have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which will also provide valuable federal funding to Vermont, as well as the Build Back Better Act, which is still being finalized in US Congress, but we anticipate will be a significant infusion to Vermont and aid in our recovery process. As Maria said, and I indicated earlier, there are more details on the Joint Fiscal website, including a link in this presentation if you want specific allotments of federal funding. Moving on to the next slide. This is meant to give you of the $10 billion that Vermont has received related to pandemic funding. The next slide, Teresa. This is meant to give you kind of a graphical depiction of where we are seeing the funds flow by federal department. There are several areas on this slide that are shaded in blue. That is meant to reflect the significant infusion of cash from the US Treasury Department. This includes both direct aid to Vermonters through economic impact payments, as well as the Coronavirus Relief Fund and the state and local fiscal recovery funds. The second largest overall is from the Small Business Administration, and this includes the payroll protection, as well as the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. The next slide drills in just a little bit deeper into the grants section of the funding, which primarily flows to state government. Again, you're going to see that the US Treasury is the largest contributor of funds to states in this area. The second largest in this slide is from the Federal Health and Human Services Administration. And this is going to include funds not only that have gone direct to our healthcare providers to provide and support and assistance through the pandemic, but it also is funds from the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, that have helped fund our pandemic response to include our vaccination program, as well as our testing program. The next slide reflects the other $5 billion that has flowed to Vermont that has been more direct aid to Vermonters. This has included the economic impact payments, as well as the payroll protection program. Next slide, please. As we prepare for the upcoming session, some of the themes that we will need to work together on include an emphasis on funding base spending with ongoing revenue, while we make strategic investments with the significant amount of one-time funding that is available to us. It's going to be critical to be diligent about the revenue outlook in the future years so that we are able to sustain our base programs. As the federal funding landscape continues to change and evolve, it'll be critical for us all to understand the funding landscape so that we are able to maximize our use of federal funds for all Vermonters. In closing, if you have additional follow-up questions, our contact information and the link to the JFO website is on the last page. Sure. Are there any questions at this time for either Maria or I, or the team from the Joint Fiscal?
Thank you. Thank you. So on the page where you, and actually it's on an earlier packet. Is that okay? So on the page where you discuss, or not you, but one of the other staff discussed, let me just get the exact number here. The obligations. There was the state teacher retirement, then there was something that said 205 million, I'm assuming, or AHS, 143 corrections. And so my question is, what does the 205 comprise and the 143? And you mentioned teacher retirement, and I was wondering if that includes state employee retirement and it just is called teacher retirement, or if that appears elsewhere.
Sure. Well, let me explain a little bit about your first part of the question. If you're to take the Medicaid global commitment corrections and other Agency of Human Services, that really reflects the total spending at the Agency of Human Services anticipated in state fiscal year 22. So when we say other Agency of Human Services, that's going to include spending at the Department for Children and Families. And it'll include, as you look across the rest of the agency, any kind of non-Medicaid spending. So it could include expenditures at the Department of Disabilities, Aging and Independent Living, or the Department of Health. It could be a whole variety of things. As you are likely aware, the Agency of Human Services is the largest agency of state government from both a budget perspective and a number of state employees perspective. And then I think Maria.
Okay, so part of your question had to do with that we delineated just the teacher's retirement, and I believe you were asking about the state employees' retirement as well. So the teacher's retirement is a separate line item that you can find in the budget. State employees' retirement is baked into every budget in state government, so it is part of state employees' retirement is included in those things that we listed on that chart. Does that make sense? Okay, good.
Okay, great. Thank you both. And the next up, Mark Peralt is going to give you a brief update on the education fund.
So good morning, everybody. I'm going to give you a really brief sort of high-level overview of the education fund outlook for FY23. Many of you are probably aware that the so-called December 1 letter that the tax commissioner prepares every year was released last Wednesday, and it includes recommendations for education property tax rates in FY23. Now, the commissioner's letter comes out in December because it's intended to provide school boards who are currently preparing budgets for submission to their voters for approval in March with a heads up on where it looks like things are going. It's really important to keep in mind that the December 1 letter, not binding in the legislature, it's just the starting point of a long series of deliberations over what tax rates are going to be in the following year. So now, even in a typical year, which we clearly are not in, there are a number of caveats that are good to keep in mind when you're reviewing the letter and taking a look at the tax rates that have been recommended. First, although we call it a recommendation, it's actually a highly prescribed task. It's a ministerial task that we ask the tax commissioner to do every year. It's basically an exercise that we go through that strips out any kind of policy considerations, and it's just based on current law. And the second reason to take them with a grain of salt is that we're going to have much better information very soon, by the end of January. The tax rates that are in there in the letter right now assume that education spending is going to grow by 4.3% next year. And, frankly, at this point, that is a very soft number. We'll have much better idea of what school boards are actually going to be proposing to their budgets by the end of January. That'll be a much better estimate of what education spending per pupil is going to be. And that's the number that the tax rates are based on. The other thing that we'll have is Tom Cavett will be presenting a revenue forecast to you in January. The December 1 letter is based on the revenue forecast that was prepared last summer. So by the middle part of January, we'll have a new revenue forecast, and that will affect the non-property tax monies coming into the education fund, which are about a third of the total revenue. So it's very significant. And finally, the letter does not include anything that you'll see in the Budget Adjustment Act, which is one of the first bills you'll see next year. The Budget Adjustment Act will make some changes to the current year appropriations, FY22, in the education fund. And they'll also indicate that some additional monies that are not included on the sheet right now will become available, specifically reversions from prior years appropriations. So there's a whole lot of additional information coming in. We go through this exercise at this point in the year to try to give school boards a heads up on where we're coming. And this year it's a little bit more difficult because there's just so much uncertainty. The letter's usefulness for school boards is going to be limited because things are so uncertain. So given all that, the letter, based on the constraints and the information that we currently have available, the letter recommended significant drop in education property tax rates next year. Specifically, homestead property tax rate would drop by almost 22 cents, and the non-homestead property tax rate would drop by almost 23 cents. So this is unprecedented. What caused it? Well, in FY21 and FY22, following the pandemic, the revenue estimates for the non-property tax revenues that come into the education fund, consensus that the consumption taxes for sales and use, purchase and use, a 1/4 of the meals and rooms tax, were all expected to perform pretty poorly. After the federal government came in and provided unemployment insurance and other benefits, the revenues did not end up tanking to the extent we thought they would. So that ended up generating a lot of money that ended up falling to the bottom line. Let's see. Oh, and then we also estimated the property tax credit quite high because it was anticipated that a lot of additional people would become eligible for a property tax credit since they lost their jobs during the thing. That also turned out to not pan out exactly the way it was anticipated. So that estimate in FY22 was also quite high, about $10 million too high. So what that ended up doing is it created a projected surplus in the education fund in the year we're currently in, FY22, of almost $90 million. So to give you a sense of what that would mean, if it was put into place, if all the surplus funds were used to lower education tax rates, which they were done in the letter, average tax bills would fall by about 8.9%. So there'd be a significant drop. That assumes that the entire $90 million goes to reduce education property tax rates next year. If no surplus funds were used, in other words, if that $90 million remained on the bottom line, which the legislature could decide to do, tax bills would still fall because of the condition of the ed fund, but they would fall by a much smaller amount, only about 2.5%. So that's going to be up for debate during the session. Again, the December 1 letter is the starting point. Although the letter is constrained in terms of how the tax rates are calculated for that purpose, the legislature doesn't need to follow them. So this will be something that you'll be hearing more about over the course of the session. The only other thing I wanted to point out is that there's also an additional contingent reserve of $14 million in the education fund on top of the 90 that was set aside at the end of the session in order to put some money aside to potentially address the cost of the cost of teachers' retired teachers' healthcare benefits. The Senate had wanted to move that cost from the general fund to the education fund. The House wasn't prepared to do that, at least at the end of last session. So what was agreed to was basically setting aside $14 million in the education fund that was not included in the tax rate calculations that's potentially available to address that problem next year. If that doesn't happen, the money will then fall to the bottom line. And that gives you an idea of how much additional money is available in the fund. It would be $14 million on top of the 90. So we're talking about huge amounts of money sitting on the bottom line of the education fund. So I think with that, I'll probably stop and ask if there's any questions.
I'll try to combine my question from last time with this one. I'm not good at putting the numbers together, but in terms of the fact that a reduced rate is offset by an increase in your property value. And of course, those value differences are very different regionally, while the rate applies more across the board. I mean, do we have an average estimate of what the real increase or reduction in property taxes paid are when you combine the reduced rate with the increased value and the increase in spending?
Right. So the 8.9% increase that I suggested for you is on tax bills, so it does incorporate that. But it's a good question, and I didn't touch on it. That there's the education grand list is projected to grow this year by about 7.6%, which is quite a bit higher than it's been in recent years. So keep in mind, though, that growth in the grand list reduces tax rates, but it doesn't change tax bills, right? Because we're just spreading the burden around a little bit differently. So that the 8.9% reduction in bills that I suggested to you is a number that takes into account growth in the grand list, as well as changes in spending and pupil count and everything else that's baked into there.
So those are already incorporated into the reduced rate, which I've now lost.
Yeah, the projections are based on the current estimate of what the grand list is going to be next year, and that's a number that's pretty much done. So it's a number that we're working with. It's not going to change very much.
I'll try to follow up later
Okay,
because I'm lost. Thank you.
Good.
I just want to take a moment and acknowledge Mark is retiring at the end of next week. And he has provided many, many years of service to the legislature, and his infinite knowledge and patience in discussing education finance proposals is astounding. I have shared an office with him for many of those years, and he has had many discussions. He knows a lot, and he's very patient, and he will connect with you, Representative Donahue. We'll make sure you get your question answered. But I just wanted to say we're going to miss him, and we've been very thankful and lucky to have had him for these many years. Thank you, Mark. And I'll also note he has to leave for another commitment, so he's not running out because of that. So thank you all for helping to acknowledge him. Yes, Representative Donahue.
Is it possible to ask my question from before? Or
yes, and they were going to tell you, is it you had a question on the budget? Is that?
Yes, I had my hand up for the budget.
So we can, what time is it? I'm trying to look at, yes, we can do, why don't we do that quickly? And then we'll hear from the next speaker. So go ahead and ask, and I'll have Maria and Sarah, do you want to come back up?
Yeah. Thank you. I was looking at the time on, I guess it was page 9 of the second presentation, the development of the FY 2023 budget, and ignoring the hoped for future economic growth, which was the sort of poised to grow 10%, all else being equal. But when we're looking at next year, it looks as though we are going to continue to have the same ongoing gap and shortfall between our revenues and our typical spending growth. Am I reading that correctly? That we don't have any relief of that ongoing significant gap between revenue and spending?
Yes, that is correct. I think as we build 23, there is, more revenues available, but we anticipate moving into fiscal year 24 and 25 that we will, the revenues will maybe go back to more traditional levels, and expenditures will stay on that same trajectory.
So that gap will continue. And
Correct.
putting aside ARPA, it is this coming year will be the same thing, that gap, right? Between 3 to 4% spending growth and 2.7% revenue growth.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
That actually provides a nice segue to the next conversation, because you are going to have federal funds to invest and think about how you're going to invest those and for the future of Vermont. And the next person who's presenting is Marcia Howard, who is the executive director and executive editor for the Federal Funds Information States. She's going to provide a federal update. And Marcia, welcome.
Thank you, Catherine, and good morning to everybody. It's nice to be with you today, and I have the pleasure, I guess, of talking to you about the massive amount of federal assistance that has been and continues to flow to Vermont and all the states from the federal treasury. So without further ado, we'll get started and talk about all these balls in the air in Washington. Thanks, Teresa. Next one. So there are many things in play right now as we enter the final month of the calendar year. Fiscal year 2022 federal appropriations, which cover the period from October 1, 2021 through September 30th, 2022, have not yet been completed. So there's that. There's a reconciliation process, which we know more familiarly as the Build Back Better Act, making its way through Congress. We've recently had an infrastructure bill pass, and that is now being implemented in Washington. There's a debt limit increase. The debt limit, the level it's currently at, is estimated to be sufficient through about December 15th, so next week. So Congress is working on that as we speak. And then finally, we have a continuing resolution which ties to the fact that 2022 appropriations have not yet been completed. And so Congress needs to do something to make sure the federal government can continue to operate, and a continuing resolution is what allows that to happen. So the next, please. So we'll start with 2022 appropriations. This chart shows the progress Congress has made on 2022 appropriations, and the 12 items listed on the chart are the 12 appropriations bills. All 12 of those have to pass in order for the discretionary appropriations process to be completed. You can see that the House has made very good progress on passing many of these. A P means that it passed the entire chamber. A C means that it passed at the committee level. And the bills shaded in green at the top of the chart are 7, I think it is, 7 that were combined into a single, what they called minibus, a little smaller than an omnibus, as one bill, and passed the House as a single piece of legislation. On the Senate side, much less progress. This is because Congress has not agreed upon overall discretionary spending levels for fiscal year 2022. And the leader of the Senate said that no appropriations bills would be considered unless and until such an agreement between the House and the Senate was forthcoming. The House, for its part, went ahead and proceeded what it deemed a budget resolution. It deemed spending levels and was able to make progress in a very partisan fashion based on doing that, but the Senate not so much. Next one, please. So the federal budget calendar, the highlights are listed here. The president's budget was released in May, which was typically the president's budget comes out in February. It's frequently been later than that in recent years, and especially with these circumstances of COVID and all of the relief bills that we're moving through, and this being the first year of a new presidential administration, the release of the president's budget was delayed until May. So I had mentioned that the House was able to make more progress than the Senate, and that was done because it deemed a discretionary spending limit. So that happened in June, and that's when the House started moving its appropriation bills. But then in August, because it wanted to pass the Build Back Better and get that moving, Congress does that through the reconciliation process. And the reconciliation process is about a budget. So they had to pass a budget resolution to facilitate moving the Build Back Better Act. So that happened in August, and again, done strictly on party lines. And after that budget resolution was adopted, the Senate did manage to take some actions on spending bills, but nothing ever got to the floor. So Congress got to September, the fiscal year ended September 30th. No appropriations bills had passed. So that's when the first continuing resolution was enacted, and it extended funding and some other policies until December 3rd, which was, just a few days ago. Then in October, the Senate released some more draft spending bills. And these are important because at some point, they are going to have to negotiate to get to a final spending package for the fiscal year. And so it's important that the House has made progress and has stuff out there. And now the Senate does, even though it's not bipartisan in the Senate, it does give an indication of what the bargaining posture will be as Congress moves toward resolving a spending bill for 2022. And then just the other day, Congress passed and the president signed a second continuing resolution. And this one I think is notable because it gives 11 more weeks of time for Congress to work things out. So I think, usually if you give yourself 11 weeks, you'll take a good 10 and a half. So we imagine that Congress will be using these weeks between now and then to try to hammer something out. And at the bottom, I just, want to reiterate this point that there has to be bipartisan bicameral agreement for Congress to pass a final budget for 2022. And we've seen no evidence of anything that looks like that now. So that's a lot of ground to cover in 11 weeks. And I think all of this links in with the other balls that are in the air that we're going to talk about and how each of these things connects one to the other. Okay, Teresa. Thank you. This chart I put in just to give a sense of where Congress's collective head is at in the budget as far as we've gotten. So the president did come out with a budget, as I said, in May. And this chart isolates a host of large grant programs that together account for about 75% of the funding we track from Washington to state capitals. And in 2021, that spending, just the discretionary spending, totaled $222 billion. And so this is just to show that the president's proposal would have increased that to $262 billion and for these programs, these selected programs, and the House even further to $279 billion. So this is really meant just to convey the message that at least among the Democratic majorities in the administration and in the House, there is still a mood to spend and send money to states. And so we see rather generous spending in these programs. And you can see at the bottom too, the footnote's important that this excludes COVID funding, because if it included COVID funding, those bar charts would be spiking into the heavens. Next one, please, Teresa. Thank you. So the second CR passed last week. As I mentioned, it extends funding through February 18th. Importantly, it also extends the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, because that program is not discretionary but mandatory, and its funding is mandatory. It requires a current authorization in order to operate. So this did it, so it's good to go until February. The CR also extends Department of Agriculture Food and Nutrition Service waivers for school meals through the end of the school year. And this is really done because of the supply chain issues that we all hear so much about. They've kind of caused problems and disruptions in certain components of school meals. So they've allowed waivers to meet some of the requirements on that. There was additional, and in both the CR number 1 and number 2, it's been additional money for Afghan resettlement and expenses related to that. And importantly, the continuing resolution, the way these typically work is that they extend funding in 2022 at the levels established in 2021. But for highway programs, an important thing has happened between then and now, and that is that a new highway bill passed, the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, that increased allowable authorized spending for highway programs. But because the CR is linking to 2021 spending instead, the additional funding in the IIJA for the highway programs cannot be released yet. That has to wait for Congress to either make it available or for Congress to pass final appropriations for the year to free up these new resources in the IIJA for the Highway Contract Authority. As I mentioned to Catherine, in Vermont, that's probably not such a huge issue right now because it's getting cold in winter and there isn't that necessarily a lot of activity on road construction. But for some states and at some point, it becomes important for everybody. Next one, please. This chart speaks to the whole notion of continuing resolutions and shutdowns and really the federal budget in general. And you may note that a couple of times I've made reference to discretionary spending. There are two big pieces of the federal budget. One is discretionary spending and one is mandatory spending. And this chart is intended to just make the point that mandatory spending is really the tail that wags the dog on the federal budget. So if you look at the top bars, you'll see that when we track the funding that flows to states, and again, this is taken from our Jim Martin table, which accounts for, as I said, about 75% of all the spending you get. Mandatory spending is $645 billion a year. This is in 2021. Whereas discretionary spending is just $222 billion. So mandatory funding is really big. And of course, Medicaid is the main reason for that. It's not the only reason for it, but it is the most important program that dictates how that turns out. In contrast, if you look at the number of programs, there are many more discretionary programs. So you see at the bottom, our table tracks a total of 89 programs. 71 of them are discretionary programs. It's just that the funding attached to them is much less than the funding attached to the big mandatory programs. So when you get a shutdown or you have a CR, a lot of these mandatory programs are able to operate anyway, whether there's a budget in place or not, because they have mandatory authority in statute. It's the discretionary programs that can be difficult, and also the federal staff. Even though the program funding may be mandatory, that doesn't mean the salaries of the federal staff are paid with mandatory funds. So you can get some mismatches there. But the point is really that a lot of federal spending is not discretionary and is not as vulnerable to shutdowns as funding on the discretionary side is. Next one, please. So the debt limit is in the news as we speak today. Things are happening. So in mid-October, Congress passed an increase in the debt limit, and it's estimated that that increase is probably sufficient to last through about, they estimated, around December 15th next week. And what we see with the debt limit over the past many, many years is that it's really the tool that the minority uses to leverage its will in negotiations with the majority party in Congress. And if you've been around long enough, you may remember that there was this thing called the Budget Control Act that was passed in 2011. And that came on the heels of the Recovery Act from the Great Recession. And it was because they had to raise the debt limit. And in order to give the votes to do that, the Republicans in Congress at the time required that this Budget Control Act be part of that. And it was. And then after it was enacted, Congress came in sort of like clockwork every couple of years to raise the caps that were in the Budget Control Act. So you see, I've referenced here these bipartisan budget acts of 2013, 15, 18, and 19, all of which, and they were all tied to raising the debt limit, and they were all tied to raising the caps, the spending caps that were included in the Budget Control Act. So as we think about raising the debt limit, we often think about what is it that the minority party wants to extract from the majority party, as they negotiate raising this debt limit. And so what I can tell you about the one today, because it started to move last night, excuse me, is that what they agreed to last night is that Congress is going to try to pass a bill, and this bill will permit a simple majority of the Senate to support an increase in the debt limit. And then a subsequent bill will actually be the increase in the debt limit that a simple majority of the Senate will vote for. So they'll need to get probably 60 votes to pass the bill to allow the vote on the debt limit, but then the debt limit itself will be a simple majority. So the House passed this bill last night, and it'll move to the Senate, and over the next several days, we'll see if this works as designed or whether we have a debt limit crisis next week. But it sounds like from media reports that they may have worked this one out, dodged this bullet. Next slide, please. So we just got past the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, lots of funding across lots of areas listed here. It's estimated to be about $1.2 trillion in spending over 5 years. And it's targeting, highways and rails and transit, which you think of with infrastructure, but this one's also big into energy, broadband, drinking and wastewater, and then, even the low-income home energy assistance program is in there for good measure. So lots of new spending going to states. And importantly, the spending is spread out over 5 years. So you won't at least get a cliff from this year to the next, but there may be a cliff eventually, but it's some years down the road. Next slide, please. We did an analysis of the various sections of the IIJA as it was moving along. And so as part of that, we tallied and reported on all the new funding. And so this is just a consolidation of, and these are just new programs, not existing programs, but new programs that were created in the IIJA that provide funding for which states are eligible. So the first two columns isolate the formula programs, and you can see there are 16 formula programs that we were able to identify, and attached to those 16 programs is about $121 billion in new funding that will flow to states. And that will just happen because they're formula programs. And then the right two columns is the competitive programs. And as usual, there are many, many more of these. There's 65 instead of just the 16, but much less funding. So it's about 77 billion in the competitive programs. And the other thing I would note on this table that, is really stunning is that if you look at the line for broadband, there are only 2 formula programs there for broadband, but it's a very large amount of funding attached to them, $44 billion. So there's been a lot of interest among the states in this money. Vermont's obviously a rural state, so I'm sure there's a great deal of interest there as well. And so this is one of the pots of money that we're especially interested to see flow and see how it's allocated when those funds start to move out. Next slide, please. So as we're getting into implementation of the IIJA, we're starting to hear and see some of the challenges associated with it. So, like I said, that was a bunch of new programs that were listed on the previous page. So federal agencies have to stand up these programs and try to get them operating and try to get money out the door as quickly as they possibly can. So that's a challenge. The formula money for programs that already exist will probably be the first out the door, but some of the new programs will take longer to get going. And then from states' perspective, just trying to keep track of this huge influx of federal spending that's coming to you, tracking the competitive announcements. When are they announcing the funds? When are they awarding the funds? How do we make sure we get in on it? Do we have the capacity to implement and design these programs ourselves? What do we have to do to be able to apply for and accept this funding? When will the feds issue their guidance? What's the timing? We need the information and we need it now. Importantly, too, many infrastructure programs have state matching requirements. So even though it's a ton of federal money, some of it will require the state to put up some money as well. Many of these are waivable in the legislation, but not all. And so on all of these things, FFIS is trying to help states through all of it. We have a dedicated section of our website. We have a big spreadsheet that lists all the programs. And as soon as we're getting the state allocations, we're sharing them with states. We're doing as many estimates in-house as we can, but for the competitive programs in particular, and even the formula programs where there's a new formula, we need to wait for the federal agencies. Next one, please. So then we have the Build Back Better Act, and that's also moving through the the IIJA is done, signed, sealed, delivered. Build Back Better Act is still moving along. And it's using a process called reconciliation, which is a budgeting process that can be used to change mandatory spending. I've been talking a lot about mandatory versus discretionary. Reconciliation is devoted to mandatory spending and tax changes. So the Build Back Better Act is moving through reconciliation. The changes it makes are changes to mandatory spending. And the reason for doing all of this is that reconciliation is protected from filibuster in the Senate. So it can move through the Senate with a simple majority vote instead of getting the 60 votes often required to override a filibuster. The House has passed the Build Back Better Act, and initially the House had a proposal that was about $3.5 trillion over 5 years. It scaled it back. So this bill, the Congressional Budget Office has scored at about $1.6 trillion in new spending, and has estimated that it would add just under $400 billion to the deficit, federal budget deficit, over 10 years. We were able to identify and isolate state local grants of about $560 billion in the Build Back Better Act. And again, we've shared with states the estimates for those programs that are funded in it. And in addition to that, Medicaid provisions in the law would add another $165 billion in funding that would flow to states through the Build Back Better Act. Its current status is that it's in the Senate. Negotiations are ongoing. There is still some resistance to some of the provisions. One of the controversial provisions is lifting a cap on the state and local tax deduction that you may be familiar with. So they're continuing to negotiate. We expect the price to come down further because I think the cost of the bill is one of the concerns. I think especially with heightened inflation, there's some concern about adding more federal spending to the mix. So we expect it to pass. We expect it to pass at a lower cost than current. And the estimate so far, or the projection, has been that the Senate would like to get this wrapped up by Christmas time, which is coming. So we'll see soon whether that will happen or not. Next slide, please. This is just a sampling of some of the programs that get funding in the Build Back Better Act. And really the point of it isn't to be comprehensive in any way, but to show just the wide range of areas. So you've got, and a big piece of it is childcare and universal pre-K. That's a big chunk of money in that. But also, electric vehicles and charging stations and incentives for people. There's an incentive in there to, for bicycle commuting. I mean, it's just so many things in there. A lot on environmental justice and training people for professions in climate resilience and mitigation, and for professions in new high skill jobs, but also, in the renewable sector. So all kinds of stuff in this bill across a wide range of federal agencies and state activities and economic activities as well. Next chart, please. So, all these balls in the air, how's it going to play out? I've outlined all the problems. I haven't necessarily provided much insight as to what the resolution will look like. So what is the end game? And it's a great question. On the budget, really the question now is when are they going to get serious about negotiations? And they have these 11 extra weeks that I mentioned. So we'll have to see how that goes. I continue to believe that the Build Back Better Act and the budget will be considered together because they're both budget issues. So I think if the Build Back Better Act, once it passes, it will inform FY22 appropriations, and 22 appropriations are unlikely, I think, to be completed until the Build Back Better Act is dispensed, either passes or doesn't pass, but it runs its course in one way or the other. So the Build Back Better Act is on this timeline for enactment by Christmas. The question now, I think, is whether or not that's even achievable. And I think it's an open question. I mean, I could say it's 50-50, but the closer we get to December 25th, the less likely it seems that that bill will be resolved by then. But, sometimes when you get to the very last minute is when deals get made. On the debt limit increase, there was some question of it maybe riding on a defense authorization bill that's moving through Congress. But as I said just yesterday and today, we're getting reporting on this new approach that seems to be working or at least proceeding. So the House has passed this bill and the Senate will presumably pass the bill, and then we'll see if we can get a separate vote on the increasing the debt limit for, I haven't heard how long the increase is for, so I can't speak to that. And then there's this other really esoteric issue about sequestering that was going to happen in January because of certain budget scoring rules that Washington uses. And this bill that is addressing the debt limit increase is also addressing this sequestration problem. And so if this bill passes, any threat of across the board cuts to Medicare and other mandatory programs will be resolved as well, because Congress, they've wrapped these two things together. And so it looks like it could be resolved within the next week or so. We'll know more. And I believe that is my final slide. I'm happy to take questions if there's time. I know I stand between you and lunch, which is never a great place to be. And our contact information is here. If any of you has any questions for me directly, or if you'd like to get access to our website and you don't have it, or you'd like to get on our email list and you're not on it, let us know and we'll take care of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Marcia. Are there any questions? Okay, I thank you all. Thank you so much, Marcia, for the presentation, and we will be in touch. And I will say we also use some of the FFIS data and information is on our website as well. And they're a great resource and they keep updating it. So thank you, Marcia, very much. Have a great day.
Oh, thank you.
We'll break for lunch now, and we will come back at 1:10. And for those of you on Zoom, we're gonna go off YouTube, but you can leave it